The production of this video was made possible by donors to the Orchestration Online Patreon initiative. Please consider adding your support to the creation of free educational internet resources by visiting our Patreon page linked below.
Hey there, this is your orchestration tutor Thomas Goss. I'm very happy to announce, once again, the start of a new orchestration analysis series. Starting in April, I'll be taking my viewers on a very thorough tour of Debussy's groundbreaking orchestral suite, La Mer. There are just so many things to say about La Mer as a piece of orchestration, let alone as a musical work. Some conductors and music historians feel that it's the first truly modern orchestral work of the 20th century. Whether or not that's true, Debussy certainly scored textures and contrasts into his work that had never before been attempted. It's probably one of the most purely original works ever composed, just in terms of orchestration and tone painting alone. Before La Mer, the general approach for musical depictions of the ocean was similar to what you can see in Ravel's Une barque sur l'océan, which was published as part of the Miroir piano suite the same year as La Mer in 1905. Cascades of arpeggiation, big pulsing sweeps of energy, and massive crashing payoffs. We've studied Ravel's own orchestration of this epic movement, and it really does wrap up that interpretive style so well that there's almost no point in going down that road anymore for future composers. But Debussy's Ocean, while just as active, is really more about emotion than motion, though there's certainly quite a bit of evocative movement. He's more interested in capturing his reactions to the ocean of his imagination, and exploring how they develop, from anticipation to shock, from darkness to light, from dread to sudden joy. Debussy calls La Mer's three movements symphonic sketches, leading to a bit of agonizing from musicologists over the precise meaning of that term. From the perspective of a composer and orchestrator, the meaning is clear. The form is that of the sketch, in which conventional strategies of thematic exposition and development are largely abandoned. But the function is symphonic. That is to say, the sections of the orchestra work together in interrelated roles in order to progress the idea of the music, rather than being purely programmatic or theatrical on the one hand, or showily soloistic on the other. The result is a highly integrated work of music, for all its freedom of direction. One of the things that I find the most amusing and endearing about La Mer, especially after having recently taught a lot of common practice harmony in my Audiation 101 course, is the almost complete lack of perfect cadences. The harmonic motion just goes where it needs to go, which is almost never a resolution back to the 1 chord from the 5 chord. There are still some intriguing key relationships throughout the work, but they don't necessarily define the overall structure. Though I usually hold off on big discussions over harmony and form in my lectures, I will talk about some of Debussy's modulations and modalities because it's hard not to in the context of the orchestration. But here in this introduction, let's look at the orchestra to start things off. If we put the instrumentation of each movement side by side, we can see that Debussy doesn't necessarily tailor separate orchestras for separate movements, as with Holst's planets. The majority of instruments are present throughout the entire piece, except that in the middle movement, the lower heavy brass and timpani are absent, which fits in well with the movement's lighter, more scherzo-like character. In the final movement, Debussy adds a contrabassoon, a bass drum, and 2 cornets, which help make his textures as grand in scope as required. Any multi-movement French orchestral work might have a similar instrumentation strategy. What's significant isn't what's added or taken away, but what Debussy does with what he's got in any particular passage. His woodwind scoring is always of the highest quality, not only in its freshness and originality, but also its generosity to the performer. Many solos represented new, definitive ways of looking at those instruments, so much so that they're often used in audition calls. And even with so many great individual wind lines, Debussy's greatest strength is revealed in how the winds work together in prominent roles. Debussy's brass scoring is also phenomenally excellent throughout, and not just in traditional approaches like fanfares, chorales, and focused unisons. There's a certain suppleness to the scoring that previous composers might have thought un-brass-like, but that we take for granted today, especially in film scoring and jazz arranging. And of course, Debussy, the supreme tone painter, uses the brass for color and support just like the winds. I mentioned the cornets a few minutes ago, and they're no less a vehicle for color, rather than just bulking up the brass to give the trumpets a more independent high end. They even get their own terrifically effective moment in the third movement, really underlining the uniqueness of their sound in contrast to the trumpets. As to the percussion, there are some counterintuitive features worth noting. The first is that the battery is actually extremely economical by comparison to the scope and variety of the scoring. And even with that limited selection of instruments, it's really the timpani and cymbals that get most of the work, emphasizing hit points, building and releasing energy, and adding an edge to textures and functions. Even so, the less often used instruments are scored in highly effective, essential ways whenever they do appear. One of these is the glockenspiel, for which Debussy also allows the option of celesta, no doubt because of quite active passages in the second movement, which would be easier under fingered keys rather than mallets. Taken all in all, the use of percussion is superbly effective in all kinds of passages, not just the big crashing tutis, but also the most delicate of moments. It's a given that Debussy's harp scoring would be particularly excellent, and some of the best of his career occurs in La Mer. Studying the proportion, functions, and scope of the harp parts is a great way for a developing composer to learn how much is enough, and how harp can be integrated into a score without wearing out its welcome on the one hand, and getting squashed out of the sound picture on the other. It's also a lesson on the best use of two interdependent harps, working together on figuration, decoration, and the occasional extravagant gesture. That just leaves the string section, about which I could write an entire book if I had the time. For now, suffice to say that this is the heart of what we think of today as Impressionist orchestration, and Debussy's approach is so potent and indispensable for 20th century composers that it lived on through the works of his contemporaries and even up today in concert and film orchestration. And yet it's not passive or dreamy or hallucinatory, but vital, engaged, and even edgy at times. Debussy reveals a deep understanding of each string instrument's character, timbre, technique, and registers, and then uses them just as coloristically as his winds and brass, but with the added quality of holding this mighty work together when it feels like the breadth of its ingenuity is going to spill over or burst at the seams. There are just too many great moments to list, but one of the best occurs in the first movement, in which 16 Debussy cellos play a four-voice chorale, with a slight touch of thickening from the horns. We'll be discussing many such inspired masterstrokes in the upcoming lecture series. In this lecture series, we'll be partnering once again with an orchestra. This time, the Los Angeles-based Kaleidoscope Chamber Orchestra has very generously allowed me to include excerpts from their 2019 performance of La Mer. Despite the title of Chamber Orchestra, they perform repertoire with a full orchestral complement, and without a conductor. The result is quite individualized, interdependent playing, in which the musicians use counting, eye contact, and physical movement in order to stay synchronized. I've linked the entire performance in the information below, and it's not to be missed. If a performance could ever prove my interpretation of the symphonic integration of La Mer, then this is it. In past orchestration analysis series, I've shared my lectures exclusively on Patreon a couple of months early, but seeing as how there's going to be quite enough over the next few months to keep my supporters busy, I'll be releasing these lectures to the whole community at a rate of about 3 per month. To really cover the whole work with the attention it deserves should take at least a dozen lectures, possibly even more. So, I hope you're ready, because the first few are coming pretty soon. Hope to see you then.